Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Today, I will take a look at the life story of this national leader from my own perspective and share this story with you. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and share this video with your friends. Comments and likes will also really help the channel, and I thank you in advance. From this story, you will learn how a boy with a difficult character, whom teachers considered hopeless, managed to become an officer and a writer, how his childhood in a world of Victorian strictness hardened his spirit, why he dreamed of glory from the very beginning, and how every defeat became a new stepping stone for him. And at the end, you will find out why it was precisely this experience that made him ready to lead the nation in the darkest hour of the 20th century. On the 30th of November, 1874, in the magnificent Blenheim Palace, the residence of the Dukes of Marlborough, a boy was born who was destined to go down in history as one of the greatest politicians. His name was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. The family into which he was born embodied the union of old British aristocracy and new American energy. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, belonged to the ancient line of the Dukes of Marlborough, while his mother, Jenny Jerome, was the daughter of a wealthy financier from New York. This blend of aristocratic strictness and American enterprise shaped Winston's future character. He grew up in the atmosphere of Victorian grandeur, when Britain ruled a quarter of the earth's land and considered itself the workshop of the world. But along with the splendor came harsh discipline. The boy understood early on that the world of the great empire did not forgive weakness. Churchill's childhood was not as cloudless as one might think. His parents paid little attention to him. His father was cold and demanding, while his mother was often absent, moving in high society. Little Winston was raised mostly by governesses and school tutors. He did not excel at school. He was caned for bad behavior. His grades were mediocre. His teachers considered him lazy and incapable. But even then, his main trait was already evident, an incredible stubbornness. He found it difficult to learn Latin and Greek, but he read books on history and military tactics with great enthusiasm. In the boy's imagination, battle maps, the figures of generals and fleets of ships came to life. Later, he admitted that it was at that time he developed the desire to become a hero, so that his name would be mentioned in textbooks and not lost among boring reports. In his youth, Churchill entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. For his family, this was a compromise. He would hardly have managed the university with its strict exams, but the army seemed a worthy path for an aristocrat. Sandhurst became a turning point for him. There, he learned discipline, patience, and the art of seeing things through to the end. From a stubborn schoolboy, he turned into a young officer, ready to serve on the front lines. After being assigned to a hussar regiment, he set off for India. There, amid the dust, heat, and endless maneuvers, he found more time for reading. He devoured volume after volume of history, philosophy, and works on military strategy. This was his true university curriculum, one he created for himself. Churchill admitted that it was then he first realized, to govern people and nations, you need to know not only guns and bayonets, but also books. Soon he found himself in Sudan, where he took part in the Battle of Omdurman. It was a battle in which the British Army fought against the Mahdist forces. There, he experienced the taste of real battle for the first time and understood the value of life and death. He not only fought but also wrote about it. His reports were sent to London and published in newspapers. It was here that Churchill's unique gift revealed itself. He knew how to combine the experience of a soldier with the talent of a storyteller. By the end of the 19th century, his name was already known to the public. Newspapers published his articles, he released his first books, but true fame came a little later, during the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. He went there as a war correspondent, was captured, and made a daring escape that was reported on the front pages of British newspapers. His return home turned him into a national hero. Churchill realized early on that fame opens doors to politics. At the age of 26, he became a member of Parliament. His path to making history was open. Returning from South Africa in the spotlight, Winston Churchill quickly realized that the platform of Parliament could be just as loud as the roar of cannons. In 1901, he was elected as a member of the House of Commons from the Conservative Party. His speeches were energetic, but often irritated his senior colleagues. The young aristocrat was considered overly self-confident, but it was precisely this confidence that allowed him to attract the attention of the public and the press. Churchill was never afraid to break with tradition. Just a few years later, he switched to the Liberal Party, which caused a storm of outrage. Some called him a traitor, others an opportunist. But he explained this move simply. Sometimes you have to change your party for the sake of your principles, not your principles for the sake of your party. For him, the most important thing was not the party banner, but the opportunity to influence the fate of the country. In the Liberal government, Churchill quickly took on important positions. He became Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, then President of the Board of Trade, and later Home Secretary. He showed an interest in social reforms, supported improving working conditions, introducing a minimum wage and unemployment insurance. But he left an especially strong mark in the role of First Lord of the Admiralty, the head of Britain's navy. In this position, he was responsible for modernizing the fleet. Churchill was convinced that the outcome of future wars would be decided not by the army, but by the navy. And it was the dreadnoughts, the huge new type of battleship, that were to become the symbol of British dominance at sea. Under his leadership, the construction of new ships equipped with modern guns and radio stations began. He was not just an administrator but also a visionary. He insisted on the development of aviation, supported the first experiments with submarines and tanks. His ideas seemed fantastic, but it was precisely these ideas that determined the future of warfare. When the First World War began in 1914, Churchill found himself at the epicenter of events. The British fleet, strengthened by his program, became the main instrument of the blockade against Germany. Churchill was proud of this, but he aspired to more. He proposed a bold plan to attack the weakest link among the opponents, the Ottoman Empire. In his imagination, a plan emerged to seize the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. If the Allies captured Constantinople, they would open a route to their ally Russia and deprive Germany of an important partner. The plan seemed brilliant on paper, but reality proved to be harsh. In 1915, Allied forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The operation quickly turned into a nightmare. Strong Turkish fortifications, command errors, and underestimation of the enemy led to disaster. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or trapped on a narrow strip of land. A storm of criticism erupted in Britain. Churchill was declared the main culprit of the failure. He was stripped of his post at the Admiralty, and it seemed that his career was over. The newspapers wrote about a reckless adventure. Parliament demanded his resignation. For Churchill, it was a blow. A man who dreamed of the glory of victory became a symbol of defeat, but he did not give up. To prove his loyalty to the country, he voluntarily went to the front and served as an officer in France. There he shared the hardships with ordinary soldiers, went on attacks, and lived in the trenches. This became his atonement before the people. Churchill spent several months in the trenches, risking his life. But it was precisely this experience that brought him closer to ordinary people. He understood the price of blood, the cost of every decision. Later he said, "War teaches more than any books. War makes a politician responsible." By the end of the war, he returned to the government, but his reputation remained controversial. Some saw him as an adventurer, others as a brave man ready to take responsibility. But one thing was clear: Churchill would never disappear from the stage. After the end of the First World War, Britain had changed. The country had lost hundreds of thousands of people, the economy had weakened, and society longed for peace and stability. Churchill, however, continued to think in terms of empire and power. He advocated for military intervention against Soviet Russia, calling to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. These statements made him a symbol of old imperialism. In the 1920s, Churchill held various ministerial posts, including Chancellor of the Exchequer. He returned the pound sterling to the gold standard, which had severe consequences for the economy. Exports fell, industry suffered, and workers went on strike. The miners' strike in 1926 turned into a general strike. Churchill took a hardline stance, published an anti-strike newspaper, and spoke out against making concessions. This earned him a reputation as an enemy of the working class. By the end of the 1920s, he found himself in political isolation. Many considered him a man of the past who did not understand the new realities. In the 1930s, when Britain was experiencing economic difficulties and a rise in socialist ideas, Churchill remained out of power. He called this period his political wilderness. But it was in this wilderness that he began to see what others refused to notice. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. Churchill closely followed his speeches, the rise of the Nazi Party, and the militarization of the Reich. At that time, most British politicians preferred not to get involved. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that Hitler could be appeased with concessions. Churchill, on the other hand, said the opposite. He warned, "Germany is rearming, the Treaty of Versailles has been violated, and Hitler's army is growing faster than the West thinks." His words seemed like alarmism. Newspapers and colleagues in Parliament mocked him, calling him a bulldog barking for no reason. But time proved him right. In 1936, the Germans sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. The Anschluss took place without resistance. Britain and France remained silent. The culmination came in the autumn of 1938. In Munich, Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Daladier signed an agreement that allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain returned to London with a paper in his hand and said, "I have brought peace for our time." Crowds greeted him. Only one person in Parliament openly declared that this was a disgrace and a betrayal. That was Churchill. He said that Britain had received not peace but disgrace and would soon receive war. His words sounded lonely but prophetic. Churchill loved vivid imagery. His phrase about appeasers became legendary. An appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. By crocodile, he meant Hitler. And indeed, after the Sudetenland, it was Czechoslovakia's turn, then Poland's. British society did not want to hear alarming predictions. People were tired of wars. They believed that concessions would save peace. But Churchill kept insisting, Hitler cannot be stopped with words, only with force. His speeches were printed on the back pages of newspapers. His name became synonymous with grim predictions. By 1939, the situation had reached a boiling point. Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, formed an alliance with Italy, and signed a pact with the USSR. On September 1st, German troops invaded Poland. The next day, Britain and France declared war on Germany. At that moment, Churchill's words rang true. He, who had been rejected and ridiculed just yesterday, was urgently brought back to the Admiralty. The newspapers wrote, Churchill is back at the helm of the Navy. His time has come. On September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began. Hitler attacked Poland, and Britain, as an ally, declared war on Germany. But the first month seemed strange. The war was happening somewhere far away, while silence reigned on the Western Front. It was called the Phony War. This illusion collapsed in the spring of 1940. German troops, with a lightning strike, captured Denmark and Norway, then invaded France. The French army, considered the strongest in Europe, fell in just 6 weeks. Europe was shaken. On May 10, 1940, Prime Minister Chamberlain resigned. King George VI invited Churchill to form a government. He was 65 years old and for the first time became the leader of the nation. Just 3 days later, Churchill addressed Parliament and the nation. His words went down in history. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It was an honest admission. An awful struggle lay ahead, but also a promise that Britain would not surrender. In the weeks that followed, his speeches became a shield for the English people. When the Germans began their offensive in France and threatened Dunkirk, Churchill delivered his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. He listed every place where the country would have to be defended: the beaches, the fields, the streets, the hills. And he ended with the words, "We shall never surrender." Millions of people listened to these speeches on the radio. Newspapers printed them on their front pages. England understood. The Prime Minister was ready to die, but not to surrender. In June 1940, the evacuation of the British Army from Dunkirk took place. Hundreds of vessels, from warships to fishing boats, carried more than 300,000 soldiers across the English Channel. It was a miracle of rescue, but also a harbinger of a great battle. After the fall of France, Britain was left alone against Hitler. The Führer was preparing an operation called Sea Lion, an invasion of the islands. But for this, the German Air Force needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain began. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the skies over London and southern England roared with engines. Thousands of German bombers attacked cities, factories, and airfields, but they were opposed by the pilots of the Royal Air Force. Young Britons, Canadians, Poles, Czechs, everyone who could fly, took to the skies. Every day became a battle. London was burning. Thousands of civilians died under the bombs. The Luftwaffe dropped millions of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. But the spirit of the country was not broken. People went down into the subway, spent the night at stations, and in the morning returned to work. Churchill visited bombed-out neighborhoods, spoke with residents, and promised, "We will endure." Churchill understood that his weapon was the word. He knew how to turn phrases into shields and swords. Of the Royal Air Force pilots, he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." These words became an eternal epitaph for the heroic pilots. But it was not only words that inspired. Churchill invented a symbol that became a worldwide sign of hope, the 2 fingers raised in a V shape, from the word victory. He made this gesture everywhere, on the streets, in Parliament, at the front. Photographs and newsreels of it spread all over the world. When London survived the most terrible air raids, the residents greeted the Prime Minister with applause. He became for them not just a politician, but a symbol of resistance. The British Bulldog, as he was called, embodied the nation's stubbornness. By the autumn of 1940, it became clear the Luftwaffe had failed to break Britain. In October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain held out. This was Nazi Germany's first defeat in World War II. The world saw that a small island managed to stand up to a huge war machine. And in this, Churchill had a personal contribution. His words and determination inspired people. His faith did not allow surrender. On June 22, 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. For Churchill, this was a fateful event. All his life, he saw communism as a mortal threat. He wrote that Bolshevism was a plague that corrodes civilization. But on that day he declared, "Any enemy of Nazism is our friend." On the radio, Churchill gave a speech in which he said, "I see Russian soldiers defending their homes, their fields, their mothers and wives. I see millions of villages, and upon all of this descends the vile Nazi machine." His words shocked the world. For the first time, he was not speaking about communist enemies, but about allies. Stalin was astonished. He did not expect support from the main critic of Soviet Russia. Already in July, he sent Churchill a letter of gratitude. A correspondence began, which soon turned into a strategic alliance. The main issue became the Second Front. Stalin demanded that it be opened in Europe immediately, but Britain and the US were stalling for time. However, they began sending aid to the USSR under the Lend-Lease program. This aid proved to be life-saving. Through northern convoys, which traveled under bombs and torpedoes in Arctic waters, the USSR received Valentine tanks, Hurricane aircraft, Studebaker trucks, food, and materials. In total, the Soviet Union received tens of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of ships, and millions of tons of cargo. Churchill knew that without this support, the USSR might not have held out. He personally persuaded Roosevelt to speed up deliveries and allocate more ships to protect the convoys. But at the same time, he was concerned that an overly strong Red Army after the war could become a threat to Europe. Churchill visited Moscow 3 times during the war. The first meeting with Stalin took place in August 1942, when fierce battles were raging near Stalingrad. The reception was cold. Stalin accused the Allies of not opening a second front. Churchill made excuses, promising that the aid would increase. Later, relations became warmer. In October 1944, Churchill flew to Moscow again. At this meeting, an event occurred that became a symbol of the cynicism of big politics. At the negotiating table, Churchill took out a scrap of paper and wrote down the percentages of influence in Eastern Europe. Romania, 90% for the USSR, 10% for the West. Greece, 90% for Britain, 10% for the USSR. Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, 50-50. He handed the paper to Stalin. Stalin took a pencil, put a check mark on it, and handed it back. Thus, in a matter of seconds, the fate of millions of people was decided. Later, Churchill called it a dirty document, but added, "It's better to settle everything quickly than to spill unnecessary blood." Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt was no less complicated. On the one hand, they were united by friendship. They wrote each other several letters a week, met at conferences, and shared responsibility for the war strategy. Roosevelt once said, "I could not wage this war without this man." But they also had serious disagreements. Roosevelt dreamed of a new world without colonies, where all nations are equal. Churchill, on the other hand, was convinced that the British Empire must survive at any cost. He said, "I will not be Prime Minister at the death of the British Empire." He spoke these words with fury. At the conferences, they argued about the future of India, the decolonization of Africa, and the future of the Middle East. But when it came to fighting Hitler, they remained united. Together, they prepared the Normandy landings. Together, they signed the Atlantic Charter, which became the foundation of the United Nations. Churchill understood that the alliance with Stalin and Roosevelt was one of necessity, not affection. He called it a strange marriage, but it was precisely this alliance that broke the back of Nazi Germany. For Britain, it meant salvation, but also the beginning of the end of the empire. Roosevelt was pushing the world toward a new order, where colonies were to gain their freedom. Stalin expanded his sphere of influence to the east. Churchill stood between two giants, trying to preserve the old empire, which was bursting at the seams. February 1945, Crimea. The Livadia Palace, once the residence of Russian emperors, became the place where the fate of the post-war world was decided. Here, 3 great leaders met, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. The atmosphere was both solemn and tense. Europe lay in ruins. The Red Army was already in Poland. The Allies were preparing to land in Germany. The main question was, what would the world look like after the fall of Nazism? Churchill tried to defend Britain's position. He demanded guarantees for Poland and hoped to limit Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. But the balance of power was unequal. The Soviet army controlled half the continent, and the United States was becoming a new global giant. Churchill found himself overshadowed by Stalin and Roosevelt. It was in Yalta that the decision to create the United Nations was made. Churchill supported this project, but he understood that real power would be concentrated in the hands of the 3 powers. For Britain, this meant the loss of its former leadership. 2 months after Yalta, Roosevelt died. For Churchill, it was a blow. He said, "I have lost my best friend." He was replaced by Harry Truman, a decisive man, but much tougher toward the USSR. Churchill understood that the world was changing. Britain, drained by the war, could not compete with the 2 superpowers. Stalin was expanding his influence to the east and the USA to the west. The empire, for whose preservation he had fought all his life, was coming apart at the seams. March 5, 1946. A small American town, Fulton, Missouri. Churchill is speaking to college students. It might have seemed like an ordinary event, but it was here that he uttered words that would go down in history. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This phrase became a symbol of the beginning of the Cold War. He warned, the USSR had established control over Eastern Europe, and now the world was divided into two camps. Many in Britain and the US saw his speech as alarmist, but history once again proved him right. The Iron Curtain truly became a reality for decades. Meanwhile, Britain was losing its colonies. In 1947, India gained independence. Churchill took this as a personal tragedy. He said, "The empire I believed in no longer exists." For him, it was the collapse of a dream he had fought for all his life. In 1951, amid an economic crisis, he became prime minister again. He was already 77 years old. He hoped to repeat his triumph, but times had changed. Britain needed not imperial slogans, but reforms and new approaches. Churchill still worked 16 hours a day, smoked cigars, drank cognac, and dictated his memoirs. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his 6-volume study called The Second World War. He became the only leader of the 20th century to achieve worldwide fame not only as a politician, but also as a writer. But his health was deteriorating. The stroke he suffered weakened him, his hearing declined, and his memory began to fail. In 1955, he finally stepped down as prime minister. He spent his remaining years at his Chartwell estate. There, he wrote, painted, and received guests. His oil paintings were exhibited at auctions and valued by collectors. On January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill died at the age of 90. Britain was plunged into mourning. His funeral became a national event. A procession 1.5 kilometers long passed through London. The dock cranes on the Thames lowered their booms in a gesture of farewell. He was seen off as a symbol of an entire era, an era when Britain was an empire and its leader was a voice that inspired millions. Churchill remains in history as a man of contradictions. He was an imperialist and a defender of democracy, an enemy of Bolshevism and an ally of Stalin, a brilliant writer and a tough politician. He was both hated and idolized, but no one was indifferent to him. In 2002, the British recognized him as the greatest Englishman in history. His image, with a cigar, top hat, and fingers raised in a V, became a symbol of the belief that even in the darkest times, one can endure. If you found this interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, and also share this video. In the comments, write about which other historical figures you'd like to learn about, or which empires and topics from the past interest you the most. There are even more stories ahead.